Stylized rocks. Let's get to the point. I'm going to teach you how to make this procedural node group that can turn any object into stylized rocks. We're going to go through the basic concepts and also the little touches that I added to make it stand out and elevate it. Now, if I started showing you which node groups to put where, you'd have no idea what's going on, because it only really comes together and makes sense after you've put all the node groups in. So I'm going to explain it all and then teach you how to make it. Now, as always, if you can't be asked to spend half an hour making this for yourself and following the tutorial, you can just go down to my Gumroad and download it. So it starts off by moving every face individually into its UV coordinates. And the UV is calculated procedurally, so you don't have to have a UV map for it. Then points are distributed on those faces, and using the fill curve node, what happens is those points are integrated into the face to give this more random geometry. We then move the faces back into their original position, and using the dual mesh node, we turn the vertices into faces and faces into vertices. Then that gives the nice rocky look. And then we extrude all of the faces and other tweaks to make it look better. So now that you know that, it should make a bit more sense what I'm doing, but let's get started making it for ourselves. Okay, start off by turning the timeline into the geometry node editor, adding a new geometry node group, and get a split edges node. What this does is it separates each face individually, and to demonstrate that I can get a scale elements node. There you can see the edges have been split to separate each individual face, and if I mute the split edges, then it all comes back together. That's what the split edges does. What we want to do is set each vertex to the position of its UV coordinate. So get a set position node and a UV unwrap node. You want to change the margin to a very small number. I think this is the smallest you can go without it bugging out. And plug the UV into the position. Turn the wireframe on, and there it is, UV unwrap. Select these, put them into a group, press tab to escape, and call it positions to UV. And the reason we're putting it into a group is because we're going to use it twice in the final thing. Then get a distribute points on faces node, get the seed and plug that into a group input. If you press Ctrl H on the group input, then that'll open everything up, and we want to make a new input called density. The default should be 5 and the minimum is 0. So duplicate the group input, Ctrl H to reduce that down, get the density, and just to make it easy to work with, multiply it by 1000 and plug that into the density. Now, because we're going to be using the fill curve node later on, we need the points to be curves, because the fill curve node only accepts curved inputs. So we're going to instant a singular point that is a curve on each point. To get an instance on points node, get a curve line and a resample curve set to 1, and then plug that into the instance. Now we've basically got a vertex on each point that's a curve. Put this in a frame and call it instance points on UV faces. Now, in order to put all the vertices back into their original position, we're going to need to store the original position inside of each vertex. So get a store named attribute node with a vector instead of a float and the name original position. Get a position node and plug that in there. Get a mesh to curve node, and we'll be doing more over here later, but just to get the general gist, I'll be simplifying this area. So get a join geometry node, plug that one in as well, and then get a fill curve node, with the group ID being the spline index. So what that means is that the mesh to curve node turns each face into its own spline, or its own curve, and the spline index is the index of each curve or face. Now, it doesn't look like there are any points on here. Let's check the density. We've got the density at 0. Let's turn that up. And that's not working, and I think I know the reason why. Because this is instancing these points, what we need to do is realize the instances. There we go, that's the kind of random geometry we're looking for. Next, we want to put the faces back to where they came from. Get a set position node, and because the fill curve node kind of rejigs all of the indexes of each point, the output here won't have the attribute that we gave it over here of the original position. What we want to do is extract the attribute from this geometry and then apply that to this geometry. So to do that, get a sample index node and a sample nearest node. The index will be plugged into there, and we're going to be using a vector which goes into the position. Now we want to be sampling the attribute, so get a named attribute node with this set to original position. We want to convert this to a mesh and then plug that into the sample nearest, and then plug this into the geometry input. And now it's returned to the original positions with the points integrated into the faces. Okay, next we're going to get a dual mesh node Now what this does is it turns vertices into faces and faces into vertices. And to make sure that we don't have the gaps here, what we can do is get a merge by distance node, and then that recombines the faces together into one mesh before we apply the dual mesh. Put these nodes into a frame, call it fill the faces, and move back to original positions. What we want to do next is extrude each one of these faces with a random offset per face, so it's not all the same distance. So get a random value node plugged into a color ramp with B-spline interpolation. Put this around here and then plug that into the offset. And now each face is extruded a random amount. To get more control over this, add a group input node, and we're going to make a new input called max height. The default will be 0.1 and the minimum is 0. So what we can do is get a multiply node and multiply this by the max height. At the moment it's 0, so let's put this to the default. There we go. And now we can have greater control over the maximum height. Now, you may notice that the edges look a bit weird, and there's a reason for that. If we go back to the fill curve, Control Shift left click to get the viewer node, you will see that the reason the edges look a bit weird is because there's only vertices at the corners of the edges, so the points are having to go all the way to the corner, whereas what we want to do is have a few more points along the edge to make it look a bit better. And we're going to be doing that over here when we converted it to a curve. So let's move this stuff back a bit. Control Shift left click on the mesh to curve, and just so we can kind of get a sense as to where the vertices are, get a value node. Control Shift left click value node, and if you have attribute text turned on, it will show the 0 on each point. So what we're going to do is we're going to resample the curve with more vertices. At the moment it is a curve, but it's a poly curve, which means it's straight edges between each control point. So what we want to do is convert this to a type of curve where it would have multiple points in between the control points, but still have them being aligned in a straight edge. So to do that, get a set spline type. We want to set it to Bezier. That's the kind of standard curve type that you'd have with 2 control points per vertex. Get a set handle type. Auto doesn't really get what we want because that's making it go smooth, whereas what we want is to have straight edges that we want to go free. Now, we don't automatically get the resample points, so to do that we're going to get a set spline resolution node and a resample curve node set to evaluated. This is the only way I found to get a consistent number of points along each edge without it kind of cutting the corner and making holes in the mesh. Now if we then delete the viewer node, we'll go back. There we go, that's already looking good. We change the resolution, you'll see the edges come a bit more fine. If we decrease it, there we get it kind of the same size as all the other blocks around it. And what we want to be able to do is to automatically change the resolution of the edge depending on the density of the points. Now I spent quite a lot of time finding out which resolution looks best with the density and the average spline length, but to save you the trouble, I'm just going to tell you what relationship I found works best. To get a group input node, get the density, plug that into a multiply, and we'll be multiplying by 10, plug that into a logarithm with a base of 2.5, and if this logarithm is less than 0.5, then we want the logarithm to be 0.5. Control H on the group input, and then let's move this down a bit. Out of the set handle type, plug that into an attribute statistic, with the attribute being the spline length. We're going to use the median output. So the spline length is the length of the sides of each face, and what we're doing is we're finding the median perimeter of each face, if that makes any sense. And we're going to plug that into a map range node from 0.2 to 0.8 and from 1 to 5. Jesus Christ, my ears are ringing. Okay, we want to get a multiply node. I'm going to multiply these two together, and then this is the resolution we're going to be using. Now you don't have to understand any of that because I don't really understand it anymore. I was understanding it when I was making it, but I can't be asked to go back through my methodology. So put this into a frame and call it make the edges have a good resolution for that density. Now you may notice that these rocks extrude individually, whereas I want the edges to be touching. And you may be thinking, oh okay, why don't you just uncheck this individual mark? But then you get this, and that's way further from what I want. So let's say we have a corner. This face will extrude like this, and this face will extrude like this. What I want is for it to extrude like this, where they touch even though they're different heights. And to do this, we're going to need to know a few things. We're going to want to know the length that it's extruded, the direction the point is looking at, so the normal vector, and we also want to know the coordinates of the point, it's x, y, and z. Once we know these things, we can use a set position node to set the position of this point along this normal vector where its distance from its original position is the length. So we want to move this point to here where this distance is L. And we can do that by scaling the normal vector by the length. That will scale it down, and then adding that vector to the position. That will give us the position of this point in space. And we can use a set position node to move this point to the new position. So we get a capture attribute node. We're going to be capturing the position of the original point and the normal vector. In order to get L, the length, what we can do is get a distance node, and we want to find the distance between its old position and its new position, which is L. We then want to get the normal vector and multiply it by this length, because by default the normal vector has a length of 1, so by multiplying it by the length, then it will come down to the length that it's extruded by. We then want to add this vector to the original position using a set position node. We want to set the vertices to this position, and we only want to set the position of the vertices on the top of the extrusion. Now, so that we can change whether we want the faces to divert over here, get a group input node, press N to bring out the panel, and we're going to add a new input called stop extrudes from diverting, where instead of a float, it's going to be a boolean, an on or off value, with the default being 1. So if this is turned on and this is turned on, then we want it to set the position of the points. So we get a boolean math node and plug that into the selection. That means if we turn this off, then they divert again, but when we turn this back on, then they're looking good again. Control H on the group input. There we go, that's looking quite good. Now, there's still an issue with this that you won't have noticed since we're using quite a low geometry base object. If we add a subdivision surface modifier, put this above our geometry nodes, or we probably need to name this, let's call it rocks, and let's turn this up a bit. See, as we increase the density of the geometry, it's lagging. It's lagging. As we increase the density of the geometry, the density of the rocks increase, and we don't really want that. To fix that, we're going to want to merge these points by distance so that they're an appropriate distance apart where it doesn't affect the density of the rocks, if that makes any sense. Before we do that, for organization's sake, let's put these into a frame, call it give rocky shape and extrude, and then put these ones in a frame called stop extrudes from diverting. Okay, back to the issue at hand. All the way at the start, just after we've done this, we're going to put the solution in here. So let's move these nodes to the end. Okay, so if we put the density to 1, and then have a look over here, with the density of 1 multiplied by 1000, that means that for every meter squared, there will be 1000 points that are distributed. Luckily, when we UV unwrap everything, it's put into a 1 by 1 square, which is 1 meter squared. So that means if there were no gaps between the faces, then the total area would be 1 meter squared with 1000 points. So what we want to do is figure out if there are 1000 points in a 1 meter squared area, what's the average distance between the points, and we can use that distance to merge the subdivided mesh so that these faces aren't too small. Okay, so we know that there are 1000 points per meter squared. Now, you may think, that looks quite similar to density. That's because it is. The density equation, density is equal to mass over volume, but instead of mass, we've got points, and instead of volume, we've got area. Instead of using rho, I'm going to be using d from now on just to simplify things. So density is equal to the number of points divided by the area. Now, let's say that we just want to look at 1 point. So P is equal to 1. Using the density, we can find out the area of that point, which may sound a bit abstract, but if I draw out a grid, the area of each point is basically this. For this point, it'll be that. For this point, it'll be that, and so on. So that's the area of each point. And then since area is length times length, we can square root the area to find out this length. And of course, the points aren't in a perfect grid, so this will be the average length between points, since this length is the same as that length. So if we're only looking at 1 point and our density is 1000, then 1000 is equal to 1 over the area of each point. So if we multiply both sides by area, that will give 1000A is equal to 1 over A times A, and this simplifies down to 1 since the divide and multiply cancel out. So we're left with 1000A is equal to 1 And then we can divide both sides by 1000, which on this side will cancel out, so we're just left with a, and 1 divided by 1000 is 1 over 1000. So this is the average area of each point. To find the length, well, area equals length squared, so L squared is equal to 1 over 1000. In order to find L, we can square root both sides, and that will give us L on this side, and the square root of 1 over 1000 on this side. Now this is the average distance between points. Now you may be thinking, what if we put 2 in here? Well, then that means our density will be 2000, so our length will be the square root of 1 over 2000. So to put this into geometry nodes, get a group input node, put the density into a multiply node, I'm going to multiply by 1000. And then we're going to put 1 over that number to get a divide node, put this to the bottom, and we're going to put 1 on the top. And then we're going to square root this, and we're also going to divide by 2, just so we're merging by this length instead of this length. Now you may be thinking, that's the density once we put it into the UV. What if the face area of the geometry does not equal 1 meter squared? And what if the faces have to be scaled down in order to fit into the 1 meter squared for the UVs? Well, what we can do is we can multiply this by how much they've scaled. And to do this, get this geometry, put a reroute down here. So if we go get the position to UV node group that we made earlier, Control C that, and paste that in over here. For these faces, we want to find out the total area. We get an attribute statistic node with the attribute being face area. And we also want to find out the sum of the face area without putting it to the UVs. So duplicate these 2 nodes and plug the geometry straight into the attribute statistic. So to find the scale factor, we simply divide this sum by this sum, and this will give us the scale factor in face area. But we want the scale factor in length, so we can just square root this. And then we can plug that into the multiply. Now this is what we're going to be plugging into the merge by distance. There we go, we lower the density of the points, and we can get quite big rocks, even though we started off with smaller faces. Now with more complex shapes than just a sphere, it can cause some holes when you use a dual mesh node. I'm going to add a switch, which allows you to turn this feature off when you need to. Get a group input node, plug this into the switch, and we're going to call this allow high res models to have a low density, and in brackets can cause holes. So you can see if we turn it off and then increase the resolution, it's using the size of the faces in the original mesh, but if we turn it on, then we can have much bigger rocks. Select all of these nodes, put them into a frame, and call it allow high res geometry to have low density. There we go, we're almost done. We just need to make the material and also send some information that we've got in the geometry nodes to the material. So get a store named attribute node, and we're going to name it top. So we're going to get this top attribute from the extrude mesh, and we can use this in the material later. Get another store named attribute node, call it height, and what we're going to have to do is capture the height that we have here in this geometry, because it'll be a different random value after we extrude the mesh. So get a capture attribute node, put that in there before the extrude mesh, and we're going to capture the height. Instead of a point, we're going to be capturing at the face, because the extrude mesh isn't extruding points, it's extruding faces. Just to make it neater, plug that in there. Doesn't really make any difference, but then get a reroute, drag that all the way along, and plug it into the store named attribute node. Next, we're going to get a set shade smooth node, and then turn this off, so that even if your base mesh is set to smooth, the final result will be set to sharp. And I've just realised you can see the holes in there already. So I told you it can cause holes. If we turn the levels down a bit, there we go. Then we're going to want to create a material, new, call it rock, get a set material node, and we're going to apply the rock material. Final thing to do in the geometry nodes editor is to add the outline, because if you saw the clip at the start, each edge has its own black line along it. And to do that, get a mesh to curve node. So that gives us every edge, and then a curve to mesh node with the profile curve of a curved circle with a super small radius and a resolution of only 3. It's not that big, so you won't notice that there's only 3 vertices. And then turn on fill caps, because that will just make it look better. Get a join geometry node, and we're going to join this with the original geometry so that we get this, and we're going to want to make a new material and call it outline. Copy the set material node, put that on here, and we're going to set it to outline. Now in order to control the outline size, add a new input called outline size with a default of 0.3 and a minimum of 0. Let's move this above those so it's there. And let's change the order of these a bit, just so it makes a bit more sense. There we go. Get a group input node. Plug the outline size into a multiply node. I'm going to multiply by 0.01 and then plug that into the radius. So that way it's easier to control. Okay, now that we're done with the geometry nodes, turn this into the shader editor. Let's do the outline first as it's the easiest. Delete the principal BSDF and add an RGB node. Make this black and just put that into the surface. There we go, that's easy. Next, go to the rock material. Let's delete the principal BSDF node and get a color ramp node. You can use any color you want, but I'm going to use the hex codes of the color I used before, and I'll paste these in the description for you to use as well. Set it to ease just to make me happy. We're going to make a black and white input to go into here, and then that's going to give us the color that we want. So we can just plug this straight into the surface. Now if you remember earlier, we stored some attributes in the mesh, so we can recall these now. Get a attribute node, and just so I don't make a typo, I'm going to copy and paste the names. This one is going to be top, I'm going to duplicate that, and this one is going to be height. So if we Control Shift left click the top a few times, you'll see it has a value of 1 at the top face, but then the bottom point will have a value of 0. And because these attributes are stored on the points, there's a smooth gradient between them, so we can use that to our advantage. To get another color ramp node, and what we're going to do, we're just going to add some points in the middle until we've got this. Now you may be thinking, what's that done? That's done fuck all. Well, if we change this to constant, then we get a more stepped gradient. And you can see some funky stuff is going on over here. So to fix that, we just move this white a bit down. There we go. And then the height, let's have a look at that. We'll see faces that don't go up much have a very dark value, whereas faces that go up more have a lighter value. Now, although this is a factor, this is a black and white value, I'm going to be using a mixed color node set to multiply. And that way we can use this factor, whereas a regular multiply node doesn't have this factor. We're going to multiply these two together and plug that into the color ramp, and then plug the color ramp into the end. So you can mess around with the factor to kind of mix between these two. I found a value of 0.75 works quite well. And a vertical split, go back into the geometry nodes editor, and at the height, we haven't accounted for the fact that you can change the maximum height over here, which will make that brighter. We want it to be the same brightness no matter what the maximum height is. So get a group input node. You may want to divide the height value by the maximum height. Get a divide node and plug the max height into the bottom one. Then that means that no matter what height it is, it'll always be the same colour. Okay, that's fixed that issue. We can close the geometry nodes now. Now if you notice at the start, not only is the mesh kind of sectioned into blocks and extruded upwards, but the material as well is sectioned into blocks and has different colours. So to do that, get a Voronoi texture node and a texture coordinate node, with the object vector being plugged into the vector of the Voronoi texture. Now let's have a look at this. Control Shift left click. That's not really what we want. If we have a look at the colour, is that any better? That's slightly better. You'll see each block has its own colour, but what we want is a black and white value. So get a colour ramp node. There you go, now we've got a black and white value. Now I decided, since we're going for a stylized look, imitating a style where maybe they have a limited number of colours, we don't want loads of different colours that might be here, 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 as well as the colour of the height of the object. That's just too many colours for this style. So set this to constant and put this at a position of 0.5. What we can do is duplicate the multiply node, plug the color ramp into the multiply node, and then this color ramp into the material output. And now you can kind of see what I'm doing. We don't want it to have too strong of an effect, so I found a value of 0.183 work quite well. So it's only slight. You can change the scale of this if you want to kind of match the scale of the object. I think it's fine as is. And one last final touch, I want to add an outline around each colour, because we've got an outline around the actual geometry, but we don't have any outline on the material itself, and that will just elevate it to the next level. So put these three nodes into a group, press N to bring up the panel. Now looking at it, this ramp is going into the bottom one, so we want this to be called the ramp output. And we don't need it to be colour, we can just have it a float, put that one at the top. And then the colour, we can call that Voronoi colour. Next, we want to change this. Instead of F1, we want smooth F1. What this means is we have a factor here that lets us blur the edges. And this is really useful for creating the outline, because if we zoom in a bit and look at this purple, let's say, in the middle, if we add a bit of smoothness, the middle doesn't change colour. The only thing that changes colour is the edges, because they're being slightly averaged with the other colours around it, even though everything is being blurred. And we can use this to our advantage to create an outline. So turn this smooth back to 0 and plug it into the group input, and then go out of the node. We want to call this node group Voronoi texture. And duplicate this, And with this second one, we want to set the smoothness to something small, like 0.017. So what this means is that this one has straight edges, whereas this one is slightly smooth. And what we can do is subtract this from each other. We go to math node, set to subtract, and there you go, we've got an outline around where the blurred bit is. And you may notice that it's smooth and then it stops, and that's because the purple has a higher value than this teal kind of colour. So when it's blurring over, the teal will increase in value, whereas the purple will decrease in value because it's being mixed with a colour that has a lower value. So what that means is that when we subtract, this side is increasing, so it has a positive number, so we can see that, and then this side is decreasing, so it's negative, so we can't see that, it's just black. So to fix that, get an absolute node, and there you can see now we've got both sides. What the absolute node does is that if it's negative, it multiplies it by -1 to make it positive. Put the smoothness back to 0.017. Now we want the outline to be a flat colour, we don't want it to be a gradient. To get a greater than node, and if it's greater than 0.01, then we want it to be white, and if it's lower than that, then it'll be black. So that just means that we don't get a gradient, we get a bold colour. Then we can duplicate the multiply node, put that over here. We want the A input to be colour ramp, and the B input to be black. That's the colour of our outline. And then we can use this as a factor to mix to the black. And there you have it, you got an outline around those rocks. So now you have a fully procedural rock generator. It works with any mesh, although saying that there's some holes there, so let's turn off the allow high-res models to have a low density, just to fix that. If you go back into object mode, you can apply the subdivision surface modifier and the geometry nodes, and now it's baked as a mesh, and you can import this into games or any scene that you want. As long as your geometry isn't deforming, it won't lag out your scene, so you don't need to apply it if you're staying with inside Blender. Wow, that took a fucking long time both to record and to edit. For context, there's 3 hours of raw footage that I've managed to condense into 27 minutes. That's fucking impressive.